In the spring of 1851, the city of York appeared unchanged to those who moved through it with confidence. Its stone streets carried the same familiar rhythm, its drawing rooms echoed with the same conversations, and its rules, spoken and unspoken, remained intact. But for Margaret Hale, that spring marked the beginning of an unraveling she did not yet know how to name. At 24, Margaret had already learned the value of composure. She had been raised in a household where affection was rationed and usefulness praised above all else. Her father, once modestly prosperous, had lost much of his financial footing through poor investments and ill health. Her mother compensated with vigilance, teaching her daughter early that survival for a woman depended on being agreeable, adaptable, and never inconvenient. Margaret had absorbed those lessons well. She was intelligent, observant, and unfailingly polite. Her manners were precise, her speech measured. She dressed with restraint, favoring muted colors and clean lines, never risking excess. She had never been encouraged to imagine romance. Stability was the goal. Respectability the reward. So when Viscount Henry Blackwood expressed interest, the family recognized opportunity long before Margaret recognized meaning. Henry was 30, established and ambitious. His title carried weight, though his fortune was not as expansive as his reputation suggested. He was a man of reason, not sentiment, and he approached marriage as he did most things, with calculation. Their engagement was announced quietly. There was no dramatic proposal, no whispered declarations. Henry spoke instead of compatibility, of mutual advantage, of Margaret's steady temperament. Her parents accepted eagerly. Margaret herself received the news with calm gratitude. She believed, perhaps because she had been trained to believe, that respect would grow into affection. That familiarity would soften restraint. The engagement lasted nearly a year. During that time, Henry visited regularly but briefly. He spoke with Margaret politely, asked after her health, commented approvingly on her efficiency. He never touched her hand longer than necessary. Never lingered. Never confided. Margaret told herself that he was reserved. That affection took time. That marriage itself would change things. She learned his preferences, adjusted her conversation, smoothed her opinions, became what she believed a future viscountess should be, supportive, unobtrusive, dependable. Society approved. She will suit him, people said. She is sensible. No one said she was cherished. The end came on an afternoon that felt indistinguishable from any other. Henry arrived at the Hale residence with no announcement, no tension evident in his manner. He accepted tea, spoke briefly with her parents, and then asked to speak with Margaret alone in the small sitting room overlooking the garden. Margaret sat opposite him, hands folded in her lap. "I will be direct," Henry said. "I have reconsidered our engagement." The words landed softly, but decisively. "I have come to believe," he continued, "that the arrangement, while respectable, no longer aligns with my circumstances." Margaret waited. He spoke of opportunity, of expectations, of connections that had become available to him, connections that required flexibility. "You have been entirely suitable," he said. "I hope you understand that. Suitable. I believe it is best we dissolve the engagement," Henry concluded. Quietly. There was no accusation. No raised voice. No drama. Margaret felt as though the room had shifted around her. "I see," she said after a moment. Henry seemed relieved by her restraint. "This need not become unpleasant," he added. "I trust your family will appreciate discretion." Within weeks, Henry was married. The announcement was brief. The bride was young, well-connected, and wealthy. Society approved the match with enthusiasm. Margaret's name was mentioned only in passing. Unfortunate, people said, but sensible. At home, silence settled heavily. Her mother avoided the subject. Her father expressed vague regret, paired with the suggestion that Margaret should not dwell on matters beyond remedy. No one asked how she felt. Margaret herself did not know how to answer. She experienced no dramatic grief. Instead, there was a slow erosion, a sense that something essential had been quietly withdrawn from her life. Her future, once clearly defined, now appeared blank. She had done everything correctly. And it had not been enough. At night, she replayed conversations, searching for a moment she had misunderstood. A misstep she could correct. But the truth became unavoidable. Henry had never chosen her. She had been convenient, acceptable, temporary, and now unnecessary. The realization was devastating not because it was cruel, but because it was rational. When the letter arrived inviting her to stay with distant relatives in Glasgow, Margaret accepted without hesitation. York had no further use for her. As she packed her belongings, she felt no anger, only exhaustion. She did not know what awaited her beyond the city. But she understood one thing with painful clarity. The life she had prepared for was no longer available. And she had no idea who she was without it. Margaret Hale arrived in Glasgow on a grey morning in late autumn, the kind of morning that made the city appear unwelcoming even to those accustomed to its temperament. Smoke drifted low over the streets, and the River Clyde moved sluggishly beneath the weight of industry and cold. She stepped down from the carriage with a single trunk and a smaller case, dressed plainly, her gloves worn thin from use. No one was waiting for her. The house she had been sent to belonged to her mother's second cousin, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a widow whose circumstances were modest and whose reputation rested on discretion rather than influence. It was a narrow brick house near the edge of the city, respectable but unremarkable, surrounded by others like it, homes built for function rather than display. Mrs. Whitfield greeted Margaret with cautious kindness. She did not embrace her. She did not ask questions. She simply said, "You may stay as long as necessary," in a tone that implied limits even as it offered refuge. Margaret thanked her and followed her inside. The room she was given was small, with a single window that looked out over the street. The bed was narrow, the furnishings sparse. It was not uncomfortable, but it was undeniably temporary. Margaret sat on the edge of the mattress that first evening, hands folded, and felt the quiet settle around her like a weight. For the first time in her life, she was not expected anywhere. The days that followed were disorienting in their emptiness. In York, time had been structured by visits, expectations, and preparation. Here there was none of that. Margaret rose early out of habit, dressed carefully though no one would see her, and took her meals with Mrs. Whitfield in polite silence. At night, sleep came unevenly. She dreamed of unfinished conversations, of rooms she could not enter, of standing just outside gatherings where her presence had once been assumed. She woke with her heart racing, her mind reaching instinctively for a purpose that was no longer waiting for her. Letters arrived from home infrequently and without warmth. "It is best you remain where you are. The matter has settled. We trust you will be sensible." Sensible. Margaret folded each letter carefully and placed it away. She did not reply. After several weeks, Mrs. Whitfield broached the subject Margaret knew must eventually arise. "I cannot support another adult indefinitely," she said one morning, not unkindly but firmly. "And I will not pretend otherwise." "I understand," Margaret replied. "There is work," Mrs. Whitfield continued. "Not suitable for a lady of your upbringing, perhaps, but respectable. A publishing office near the university. They require someone literate, organized." Margaret hesitated only a moment. "I will take it," she said. The office was nothing like the spaces Margaret had once imagined occupying. It was cramped and dimly lit, filled with the smell of ink and damp paper. Shelves bowed under the weight of ledgers and manuscripts. Men moved through the space with distracted urgency, scarcely glancing at her as she was introduced. Her duties were simple at first. Sorting correspondence, recording transactions, proofreading copy for errors. She worked quietly, making mistakes, correcting them, learning. No one praised her. No one apologized for assigning her tasks beneath her former status. And strangely, that suited her. The work demanded her attention fully. It left little room for rumination. At the end of each day, she returned to Mrs. Whitfield's house physically tired, a sensation that was new and oddly grounding. Weeks turned into months. Margaret's confidence did not arrive suddenly. It crept in gradually, through small acknowledgments, a nod of approval, a task completed efficiently, a question asked and answered correctly. She learned to negotiate with printers, to organize schedules, to manage accounts. For the first time, she felt useful in a way that did not depend on pleasing anyone. Still, the nights remained difficult. There were moments, unexpected and sharp, when the past returned without warning. Seeing a woman of her age walking with an escort, hearing laughter through an open window, catching sight of herself in a mirror and remembering who she had been meant to become. In those moments, the grief resurfaced, not loudly but insistently. One evening, overwhelmed by the weight of it, Margaret allowed herself to cry openly for the first time since leaving York. The tears came without restraint, surprising her with their force. When they subsided, she felt emptied, but not broken. Something had shifted. The following day, she returned to work as usual. It was there, several months later, that she first spoke at length with Andrew Lennox. He was not employed by the office but visited frequently, an academic connected to the university, involved in educational reform and publishing. He was older than Margaret by a decade, with a reserved manner and a habit of listening intently before speaking. Their initial conversations were practical. About schedules. About revisions. About distribution. Andrew treated Margaret as competent without ceremony. He did not inquire into her background, did not express surprise at her intelligence, did not offer unsolicited encouragement. Over time their discussions broadened. They spoke of education, of access, of the limitations imposed by tradition. Margaret found herself contributing thoughtfully, without the careful self-censorship she had once practiced. Andrew noticed. "You consider matters deeply," he remarked one afternoon. "That is rare." Margaret smiled faintly. "I have had practice," she said. He did not ask what she meant. That restraint earned her trust. Their association remained professional for some time, marked by mutual respect rather than familiarity. Margaret appreciated the absence of expectation. She had no desire for romance. The wounds left by her engagement had not healed enough to allow vulnerability. What she wanted, though she did not yet fully understand it, was autonomy. As the year passed, Margaret's role expanded. She was offered a modest salary. She accepted it without hesitation. The independence it afforded her was transformative, not because it elevated her status but because it anchored her. She began to make choices without consulting anyone. How to spend her evenings. Which books to read. What opinions to voice. The freedom was quiet but it was real. At home, Mrs. Whitfield observed these changes without comment. Their relationship grew easier, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Margaret contributed to household expenses. She no longer felt like a guest. Letters from York became less frequent. When one arrived announcing Henry Blackwood's growing dissatisfaction with married life, Margaret felt nothing more than mild surprise. The information seemed irrelevant now, like news from a country she no longer inhabited. She did not dwell on it. One evening, as winter settled heavily over Glasgow, Margaret and Andrew found themselves walking together after a long day. Snow dusted the streets, softening the harsh edges of the city. "You are different from when I first met you," Andrew said. "So are you," Margaret replied. "No," he said gently. "I was always this way. You have changed." She considered that. "I was allowed to," she said finally. He nodded, understanding more than she had said. Their closeness deepened gradually. There were no declarations. No urgency. Their bond formed through conversation, shared purpose, and mutual regard. Margaret remained cautious. She did not offer her heart easily. Andrew did not press. What grew between them was not dependence, but alignment. By the time spring returned, Margaret realized that she no longer felt displaced. Glasgow had become something like a home. And yet, when the invitation arrived, requesting her presence in Edinburgh for professional reasons, Margaret did not hesitate. She sensed instinctively that the life she had built was ready to be tested. She packed her belongings carefully. This time she carried more than she had brought with her. She carried confidence earned through effort. She carried clarity. And though she did not yet know it, she carried the strength to face the past without surrendering to it. As the train pulled away from Glasgow, Margaret Hale looked out at the receding city, not with regret but with gratitude. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was moving forward, on her own terms. Margaret Hale arrived in Edinburgh in the early summer of 1856, when the city was at its most deceptive. Sunlight softened the severity of the stone buildings, and the wind carried the faint promise of warmth across the bridges and closes. To an outsider, Edinburgh appeared dignified, intellectual, and orderly, a city governed by reason and restraint. Margaret understood at once why she had been summoned here. This was a city that respected achievement more than birth, competence more than performance. If she was to be judged anywhere on the merits she had earned rather than the future she had lost, it would be here. Her invitation had come through professional channels, addressed not to her father, nor to any relation of influence, but to Miss Margaret Hale, recognized for her work in publishing and educational administration. The formality of that alone had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She took lodgings near George Street, modest but comfortable, and unpacked with a calm she did not attempt to question. She no longer mistook unease for fear. Experience had taught her the difference. The first days passed in a careful rhythm. Meetings during the morning. Correspondence in the afternoon. Evenings reserved for reading, reflection, and occasional walks through the city. Margaret observed without absorbing herself into expectations. She had learned that composure was not the same as passivity. Her work was received with respect. Not enthusiasm but attention, and attention earned through preparation and clarity. She spoke precisely, offered solutions rather than opinions, and accepted disagreement without defensiveness. People listened. That, she had learned, was the truest measure of authority. It was inevitable that her return to broader society would not go unnoticed. Edinburgh was smaller than London, and reputations traveled quickly across social circles that overlapped more than they admitted. Margaret did not seek out familiar names. They found her. The first encounter came at a formal dinner hosted by a committee overseeing educational grants. She arrived alone, dressed simply but well, her attire neither fashionable nor outdated. She took her seat with ease, neither deferring nor asserting herself unnecessarily. Across the table sat Henry Blackwood. Time had altered him more than she expected. He was still well-dressed, still composed, but there was a weariness about him now, a faint impatience beneath the polished exterior. Marriage had not transformed him into the settled figure society had anticipated. It had, instead, exposed the limitations of his ambition. When he recognized Margaret, his expression faltered briefly before settling into controlled surprise. "Miss Hale," he said later, approaching her with a cautious smile. "I had not realized you were in Edinburgh." "I am," she replied simply. They exchanged pleasantries that revealed nothing. Others drifted nearby, sensing history without understanding it. Eventually Henry spoke more quietly. "You seem well," he said. "I am," Margaret answered. There was no irony in her voice. No edge. Henry studied her as though searching for something he could no longer name. "I have often wondered," he began, then stopped. "Perhaps this is not the place." Margaret inclined her head. "Perhaps not." The restraint unsettled him. In the days that followed, Henry sought her out more deliberately. Not openly, never openly, but through shared acquaintances and carefully engineered proximity. Each encounter was polite. Each conversation edged toward familiarity without ever achieving it. Finally, one afternoon he requested a private meeting. Margaret considered the request carefully before agreeing. Not out of hesitation but out of respect for her own clarity. They met in a quiet drawing room lent by a mutual contact. The atmosphere was neutral, devoid of sentiment. Henry began without preamble. "I was wrong," he said. Margaret listened. "I believed," he continued, "that suitability was enough. That stability would bring contentment. I did not understand what I was relinquishing." She met his gaze steadily. "You understood perfectly," she said. "You valued advantage. That has not changed." His jaw tightened. "My marriage has been instructive," he admitted. "I find myself dissatisfied." "That is unfortunate," Margaret replied without softness or cruelty. "I have come to see," Henry said carefully, That you were undervalued. Margaret exhaled slowly. I was not undervalued, she said. I was misused. The distinction silenced him. You ask for understanding now, she continued, but you did not ask for it then. You made a rational decision. So did I when I accepted its consequences. Henry searched her face, perhaps hoping to find regret. What if, he began, there were another possibility? Margaret stood. There is not, she said. And there never will be. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply closed the conversation. When Henry left, he did so diminished, not because she had triumphed but because she had denied him relevance. The encounter marked a turning point Margaret had not anticipated. She felt no exhilaration, no release, only certainty. Andrew Lennox arrived in Edinburgh a week later. His presence was unannounced, his reasons practical. Meetings, proposals, negotiations. Yet when Margaret saw him across a crowded room, she felt a steadiness she had once believed unattainable. You look at home here, he said when they spoke. I am, she replied. More than I expected. They resumed their companionship without ceremony. Walks through the new town. Evenings spent reviewing papers. Conversations that drifted from the practical to the philosophical without strain. Andrew did not ask about Henry. Margaret did not volunteer the story. Their understanding had long since outgrown the need for explanation. One evening, after a particularly long day, they walked along Prince's Street. The city stretched before them in soft twilight. The air was cool, the sky faintly luminous. May I ask you something? Andrew said. You may. Are you content? Margaret considered the question carefully. Yes, she said. But not because everything is resolved. Because I no longer require it to be. Andrew smiled, a quiet acknowledgement rather than celebration. Their relationship deepened not through declarations, but through shared intention. They spoke openly about expectations, limitations, and the realities of partnership. Marriage was discussed, not as a culmination but as a choice. I do not wish to be rescued, Margaret said once. I would not know how, Andrew replied. Nor would I try. That was enough. The decision to marry came without urgency. There were practical considerations, professional implications, family responses to be anticipated. A cinematic Victorian ballroom scene at night. 3 young nobles stand in the foreground. The central woman, mid-20s, with fair skin and chestnut hair and a soft half-updo, wears a royal sapphire blue silk gown with subtle gold embroidery, standing poised and confident. To her left, a younger blonde woman, early 20s, in a blush-pink lace dress watches quietly. To the right, a tall gentleman, early 30s, with dark wavy hair wears a black velvet coat with gold embroidery, exuding mystery. The background features an opulent palace ballroom with glowing crystal chandeliers, golden pillars, candlelight reflections, and softly blurred aristocratic guests. Warm cinematic lighting, shallow depth of field, rich color grading, romantic tension, viral YouTube thumbnail style, ultra-realistic 4K, *.